Donald Trump's arrival in Washington, D.C., was anything but ordinary as the nation watched in stunned silence, the roar of the engines echoing over the Capitol while reporters scrambled to broadcast the latest updates, describing the scene as a political earthquake that shook not only the White House but the entire country, because this was not just another routine landing or a simple return to the Capitol for business as usual. This was a landing under a cloud of legal chaos, breaking news. Headlines flashing across every major network, a swirl of federal investigations, congressional hearings, and courtroom dramas all converging at the same time to create a storm so fierce that even his most loyal supporters seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, because this was the moment that months of speculation had been leading to, the moment where campaign rallies, fiery speeches, and repeated claims of witch hunts collided with the reality of subpoenas, indictments, and judges calling for accountability, a perfect storm of political theater and legal peril that would force Trump to face not just his critics but the full weight of Washington itself. And as Air Force-style security vehicles rolled into position and cameras zoomed in on the runway, the former president descended the steps with his usual mix of defiance and calculated showmanship. Yet there was a visible tension in his posture, a sense that even he understood the gravity of what awaited him, because waiting on the other side of that runway were not cheering crowds or campaign banners but stern-faced federal marshals, grim-faced advisors, and a media frenzy ready to dissect every gesture, every word, every step he took, turning the airport tarmac into a stage where the future of American politics seemed to hang in the balance. And as he made his way into the motorcade that would take him straight into the heart of the Capitol, the streets themselves felt charged. Protesters gathering on one side with signs calling for justice, counter-protesters waving flags on the other, police forming barriers to keep them apart, all while the news anchors filled airtime with speculation about what exactly would unfold in the coming hours, whether Trump would strike a tone of defiance, whether he would double down on his claims of political persecution, or whether, for the first time, he might have to strike a note of caution, because this was not just another rally or speech. This was a legal confrontation with stakes that could reshape his future, the future of his campaign, and perhaps even the future of the Republican Party. And as the motorcade sped down Constitution Avenue, cameras caught glimpses of his face through the tinted glass, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the city he once commanded from the Oval Office, now returning not as president but as a man facing unprecedented legal and political battles, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The most polarizing figure in modern American politics coming back to the Capitol under a storm of subpoenas, a moment that historians and journalists would one day write about as the turning point where the mythos of Trump collided with the machinery of American justice, where the chants of "Make America Great Again" met the gavel of accountability, and the entire nation seemed to hold its collective breath, watching the spectacle unfold live on television, refreshing social media feeds, reacting in real time as news outlets pushed notifications about sealed indictments, grand jury testimony, and potential criminal charges that could range from election interference to obstruction of justice, and the gravity of it all seemed to hang over the city like a thundercloud, the monuments and marble buildings of Washington serving as a silent backdrop to a drama that was as much about the soul of the nation as it was about the fate of one man. And by the time the motorcade reached its destination, a federal courthouse fortified with barricades and surrounded by throngs of reporters, the narrative had shifted from speculation to confrontation. This was no longer about what might happen but about what was happening in real time, the once unthinkable image of a former president being escorted into a courthouse becoming reality, shaking the political system to its core. And no matter where one stood on the political spectrum, no one could deny that this was history unfolding. A moment that would be replayed in documentaries, studied in classrooms, and debated in living rooms for decades to come, because this was not merely a headline or a news cycle. This was the story of power meeting consequence, of politics meeting the law, of a figure who had dominated the news for years now facing the most consequential chapter of his life. And as cameras followed him through the courthouse doors, the roar of protesters outside mixed with the clicking of press cameras inside, creating a soundtrack of democracy in crisis, a nation watching itself in the mirror, asking whether justice would truly be blind and whether the system built to hold leaders accountable could withstand the test of its most controversial figure. And somewhere in the midst of that chaos, Trump, ever the showman, knew that the world's eyes were on him, that every word he spoke, every expression on his face, every pause and gesture would be dissected, replayed, and interpreted, because this was no longer just about him but about the country he once led. A country now wrestling with what it means to hold a former president accountable, and as the day wore on and the legal proceedings began, the atmosphere in Washington grew even more electric, with lawmakers on Capitol Hill giving impromptu press conferences, allies rushing to defend him, critics insisting this was proof that no one was above the law, and through it all, the city remained on edge, a powder keg of politics, law, and emotion waiting for the next spark, because whatever happened inside that courthouse would not stay there. It would reverberate across the nation, influence the coming elections, and potentially alter the course of American history forever. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, a kind of electric tension that only grows when the entire nation is waiting for the outcome, and Trump, flanked by attorneys and Secret Service agents, moved through the corridors like a man walking through history, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors as journalists shouted questions that went unanswered, cameras flashing, every second captured from multiple angles, and somewhere in that moment the weight of what was happening seemed to settle over everyone present, even the most seasoned political reporters looking slightly shaken as they narrated events live, reminding viewers that no other president in American history had ever been in this position, no other leader had ever stood at the intersection of so much power, controversy, and legal jeopardy all at once, and as he entered the courtroom, the tension seemed to rise another notch, the room falling silent except for the shuffling of papers, the quiet hum of cameras outside, and the sound of the judge calling the session to order, a judge whose impartial gaze now represented not just the law but the collective conscience of a nation grappling with what accountability really means when it comes to someone who once held the highest office in the land, and as prosecutors laid out their opening statements, their words were measured, precise, and devastating, outlining a case that spanned months of investigation, thousands of pages of documents, dozens of witness testimonies, a case that painted a picture not just of alleged crimes but of a pattern of behavior that challenged the very norms of American democracy, and Trump, sitting at the defense table, appeared alternately defiant and contemplative, scribbling notes, whispering to his attorneys, glancing occasionally toward the gallery where allies, critics, and curious observers sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, relief, and disbelief, because for some this was the long-awaited moment of justice, for others it was proof of a political witch hunt, and for nearly everyone watching it was surreal. A moment that blurred the line between reality and history, and as testimony began, the courtroom became a theater of competing narratives, prosecutors presenting evidence of pressure campaigns, back-channel communications, and efforts to overturn election results, while defense attorneys pushed back, framing their client as a victim of a weaponized justice system, their voices rising with indignation as they warned of the dangers of criminalizing political disputes, and the judge listened carefully, occasionally interjecting to keep the proceedings on track, aware that every decision, every ruling, every word spoken in that courtroom would be analyzed not just by legal scholars but by the entire country, a country already divided and now watching as the drama played out in real time, and outside the courthouse, the crowds grew larger, news helicopters circling overhead, social media feeds exploding with commentary, hashtags trending worldwide, politicians giving fiery interviews on cable news, some demanding Trump's immediate conviction, others calling the trial a sham, and through it all, Washington seemed to pulse with nervous energy, as if the entire city had become the center of gravity for the world, pulling attention from every corner of the globe, and inside the courtroom the case continued to unfold, witnesses taking the stand, their testimony alternating between explosive revelations and quiet, damning details, and every time a new piece of evidence was displayed on the projector, the room would seem to tighten, reporters furiously taking notes, the defense team scribbling counterarguments, Trump occasionally shaking his head or pursing his lips, his frustration visible, his body language revealing a man unaccustomed to being in a position where he is not in control, and yet even in that moment, there was an undeniable air of performance about him, as though he understood that this was not just a legal battle but a political stage, that every expression would be broadcast to millions of viewers, every reaction turned into a viral clip, and so he projected strength, occasionally nodding along with his attorneys, sometimes leaning back with arms crossed as if daring the prosecution to do their worst, and as hours stretched into the evening, the gravity of the day's proceedings became clear. This was not a quick hearing or a routine legal formality, This was the opening chapter of what promised to be one of the most consequential trials in American history, a trial that could redefine presidential immunity, the limits of executive power, and the very idea of accountability in a constitutional republic. And as court adjourned for the day, Trump rose slowly, his expression unreadable, pausing for a moment as if to take in the gravity of the room before walking out under the watchful eyes of cameras, his motorcade waiting to whisk him away once again through the streets of Washington, past cheering and jeering crowds, back to a secure location where advisors would brief him on public reaction, polling numbers, and the next steps in a legal strategy that could determine whether he remained a free man or faced the unthinkable prospect of conviction. And as night fell over the Capitol, the story was far from over. News outlets running wall-to-wall coverage, pundits debating. Late into the night, Americans arguing online and around dinner tables, the sense growing that whatever happened next would not just impact one man's future but could shake the foundations of American politics for years to come, because this was not simply a trial, it was a test of the system itself, a test of whether the rule of law could withstand the storm of populism, partisanship, and raw political power that had defined the Trump era. And as the camera zoomed in on the courthouse steps, one last time before broadcasts signed off for the night, the image of Trump's motorcade disappearing into the darkened streets of Washington became the perfect closing shot, a symbol of a country at a crossroads, a narrative still unfolding, and a storm that was only just beginning to rage. By the next morning, the entire nation seemed to be awake early, glued to screens as cable networks replayed every second of the previous day's courtroom drama, every frame of Trump's motorcade arriving, every shot of him walking into the courthouse, pundits analyzing his body language and tone of voice, legal experts debating what the charges meant, and across the country a deep polarization became visible yet again, with some Americans cheering the process as proof that no one is above the law while others decried it as an unprecedented attack on democracy itself. And into this storm Trump decided to speak, taking to his social media platform in a blistering series of posts that mixed defiance, grievance, and campaign rhetoric, framing himself as a fighter standing up not just for himself but for the American people, insisting that the case was politically motivated, that the real target was not him but his supporters, that the establishment feared his movements so much they would stop at nothing to prevent his return to power, and within minutes those posts were amplified by allies, repeated on talk radio and conservative media, sparking a fresh wave of commentary and outrage, with supporters organizing rallies outside the courthouse for the next hearing, vowing to show that they would not be silenced, while critics responded with equal intensity, planning counter-protests and demanding that the courts move swiftly to deliver justice. And as the political temperature rose, Washington braced for another day of chaos, the courthouse surrounded by even tighter security, police and National Guard on standby, barricades stretching for blocks, the air filled with the sound of chanting crowds as Trump's motorcade approached again, this time greeted not just by cameras but by a divided sea of Americans, one side waving flags and chanting his name, the other holding signs calling for accountability, the clash of voices echoing through the streets as though the entire country had been distilled into that one intersection. And when Trump stepped out of the vehicle, he raised a fist in the air, a gesture that instantly went viral, sparking a frenzy of headlines, some framing it as a symbol of defiance, others as a dangerous escalation. And as he entered the courthouse the narrative of the trial shifted yet again, because now it was not just about legal arguments but about a man turning his defense into a rallying cry, turning the courtroom into a stage from which to project his message to the world. And inside, as proceedings resumed, Trump's attorneys adopted an even more combative tone, challenging evidence, objecting frequently, presenting their client as a victim of overreach, while outside the courthouse his supporters live-streamed the day's events, chanting, praying, and framing themselves as participants in a historic struggle, and the media fed on every moment, creating a feedback loop that made the trial not just a legal battle but the dominant cultural and political story of the day, overshadowing everything else happening in the country. And by evening, when Trump emerged once again, he stopped at the microphones for the first time, delivering a fiery speech that lasted nearly 15 minutes, railing against the charges, calling the process a disgrace, warning that what was happening to him could happen to anyone, and urging his followers to stay strong and peaceful but also to fight like never before, for the future of the country, a line that immediately drew criticism from opponents who said it was inciting further division, while supporters hailed it as a rallying call to stand up to what they saw as a corrupt system, and as night fell, the images of his speech were broadcast worldwide, commentators debating whether it was a brilliant act of political theater or a dangerous escalation that could further destabilize an already fragile situation, and across America, ordinary citizens wrestled with conflicting emotions, anger, hope, fear, exhaustion, as the trial became more than just a legal proceeding but a mirror held up to the nation, forcing it to confront questions about power, accountability, justice, and the meaning of democracy itself. And in that moment the Capitol seemed to hold its breath once more, because everyone knew that this was only the beginning, that the coming weeks would bring more witnesses, more revelations, more battles inside and outside the courtroom, and that whatever the verdict, the country would never quite be the same, because this was not just the story of one man but the story of a nation at a crossroads. And as the cameras pulled back for a final wide shot of the courthouse bathed in floodlights, the chants of protesters echoing into the night sky, the city looked like the stage of a drama that had no easy ending, no clear resolution, only the promise of more conflict to come, and the sense that history was still being written in real time, its final chapter yet to be decided, leaving viewers around the world with the uneasy awareness that whatever happened next would shape not just the fate of Donald Trump but the destiny of the United States itself. Days turned into weeks as the trial gripped the nation like a vice, every new witness, every legal argument dissected in real time, the country split into two camps watching the same events through entirely different lenses, one side seeing proof that justice was finally being served, the other seeing a political hit job meant to crush a movement. And all the while Trump continued to dominate the headlines, his speeches growing more pointed, his fundraising soaring as he painted himself as the ultimate outsider fighting a corrupt establishment, and as the final week of testimony began, Washington felt more like a city under siege, with security at its highest levels, international journalists crowding the press pool, and speculation at a fever pitch about what the verdict would be, and when closing arguments were delivered, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The air so still you could hear the shuffle of paper as the prosecution made its final appeal, arguing that the rule of law must apply to everyone, even those who have held the highest office, while the defense thundered back that convicting Trump would set a dangerous precedent, criminalizing politics and dividing the nation even further, and when the jury was sent out to deliberate, the entire country seemed to stop, waiting, refreshing news feeds, watching live coverage of an empty courtroom, and after hours that felt like days. The word came that the jury had reached a decision, sending a ripple through the media, through the protesters outside, through every home and office where people were watching, and as Trump returned to the courthouse for the reading of the verdict, the scene outside was unlike anything seen in modern times. Helicopters circling, news vans jammed along the streets, supporters praying aloud, opponents chanting for accountability, and when he walked inside, his face was set like stone, his jaw clenched, the weight of history visible in his expression, because this was the moment that would define not just his future but perhaps the future of American politics itself. And when the judge asked the jury foreperson for the verdict, the room went silent, every camera locked in place, every breath held. And as the verdict was read count by count, the reactions were immediate and visceral, gasps from the gallery, tears from some, clenched fists from others, Trump himself staring straight ahead, motionless, until the final count was read, and then he turned slowly to look at his attorneys, nodded once, and stood, his voice measured but defiant as he vowed to appeal, to continue fighting, to take his case not just through the courts but to the American people. And outside, the reaction was explosive, cheers erupting on one side of the barricades, outrage on the other, commentators rushing to frame the moment as either the ultimate vindication of the justice system or the greatest miscarriage of justice in modern memory. And through it all Trump's motorcade once again rolled through the streets of Washington, cameras following every second, capturing a man who had just made history whether one viewed him as a martyr or a cautionary tale. And as night fell on the Capitol, the images of that day were replayed again and again, the jury, the judge, the protests, Trump raising a fist as he left, becoming instant icons of an era. And while no one knew what the future would hold, whether Trump would succeed in overturning the verdict on appeal or whether he would use the moment to galvanize his movement even further, one thing was certain: the nation had crossed a threshold from which it could not return. A line had been drawn that would forever mark the story of American democracy, and as the cameras faded to black and anchors signed off for the night, the city of Washington stood bathed in quiet, the courthouse now empty, the crowds dispersing, but the echoes of the day still hanging in the air like distant thunder, a reminder that the story was far from over, that this was not an ending but the beginning of a new chapter in the political life of the United States. One that would test the resilience of its institutions, the patience of its people, and the capacity of its democracy to withstand the storms still to come.